Do you know that American taxpayers are paying billions of dollars every year for a silent war they didn't even know they are fighting? Today, I am uncovering the massive domestic cost of US sanctions, and I will explain why they might be hurting US taxpayers as much as they hurt the victims of sanctions. US politicians and war hawks claim that sanctions are surgical tools or they are quite efficient. But if that is the case, then why they are linked to 800,000 deaths in 2021 alone? And why is the US government now tracking over 18,000 targets, from billionaire oligarchs to the banks where hardworking people save their money? I have spent a good amount of time digging through US Treasury Department records and news and journal articles to find the data that news cycles usually miss. This is Sight Unseen with Sharique. Let's go to the unseen side of US sanctions. Before we move further, we must ask, what are sanctions? Sanctions are basically, you may call it government-enforced economic timeouts. They can limit what a country, a company, or even an individual can do with their own money. And that usually boils down to four things. The first and the most obvious is restriction on financial access, meaning sanctions block banks or governments from moving money through the global financial system. If you happen to live in a sanctioned country, you may not be able to transfer or receive money. If you are persistent enough, you might find a back channel, but that's going to be illegal. So the second thing is, sanctions also restricts what kind of goods can be imported or exported from the country. We are talking about important stuffs like oil, technology, machine, and not so important stuff like life-saving medication. Apart from these, sanctions also freeze money or property held abroad. If you are as rich as Roman Abramovich, say bye to your big beautiful yacht, I don't know, whatever. And then there are travel bans. Sanctioned individuals are banned from traveling or doing businesses internationally. That's a good way to save money. Tell your friends you're not broke, you're just grounded. You see, sanctions put pressure on everything that a country or a company requires in this day and age to survive. The most interesting part of all these is that restrictions work through the global financial system, which the world is already dependent on. And that brings us to why the US is basically the final boss of the whole system. Before we go further, remember the number I mentioned? 18,000 targets? How does this sanction list go this big? It is because of the 50% rule. For example, if the US sanctions one bad guy, any company he owns 50% of also gets sanctioned. And if that company owns 50% of another company, they are gone too. That's how US sanctions can take down entire corporate family trees. This has turned a scalpel into a sledgehammer that hits so many people that even the world's biggest bank cannot keep track of the list without hiring an army of compliance officers. So we know what sanctions are, but let's see, why are US sanctions so powerful? If I may give the short answer, it's because the US is the global economy's central nervous system. Most global trade is done in US currency. When Indonesia buys something from Malaysia, they're not doing business in rupiah or Malaysian ringgit, but rather they are doing their transaction in dollars. Because those dollars eventually pass through the US and correspondent banks, the US government gets to play referee in a game they're not technically even playing in. Another reason why US sanctions are powerful has to do with banking choke points. To make it simple, banks are not like two friends handing each other cash at the end of the month. When a bank in a sanctioned country initiates a transaction with a bank in another country, that payment moves through several channels. You can think of them as checkpoints. One of the most important checkpoints is the US financial system. This is where the catch happens. If the system detects that a bank is processing transactions with a sanctioned entity, the bank can be penalized with secondary sanctions. In other words, a company does not need to be American to be affected by US sanctions. Apart from that, many of the world's largest corporations, just name any big company that comes to your mind right now, I'm pretty sure they will be either based in America or doing extensive amount of business in America. So the thing is, these companies do not want to risk doing business with a sanctioned country. Think about that. If you are a bank manager sitting in London or Paris, and if you have to deal with a transaction that involves sanctioned individuals or entities, the question in your mind is not whether this is legal in your country. Rather, you are asking whether this transaction will get flagged. Usually, the answer is decline the transaction. It's safer to say no than to risk being fined billions of dollars. Some of the banks have paid this much amount of money to fix their compliance issues. But here's the issue. If the US sanctions are so powerful, Why have they failed 87% of the time since 1970s? There are a couple of reasons for that. To make it easy, think of sanctions like group projects. They only work if everybody does their job. When US put unilateral sanctions on a country, sometimes even the allies try to undercut it. Also, the targeted governments don't just give up, they adjust to restrictions to circumvent the sanctions. And then there are US competitors such as Russia and China. They are more than willing to help a sanctioned country. They collaborate with the sanctioned countries to find new financial routes that make US financial walls look like a picket fence. And then there's this issue of targeting. Politicians will tell you that sanctions are quite precise, but as I mentioned earlier, they become very big. Most of the times when US sanctions a country, they don't have a plan B. So once they sanction, they keep the sanctions there, locked in a place, because removing the sanctions make them look like a fool. I think we now have a clear picture of what sanctions are and how they work. Sanctions are designed to serve US interests, but the question is US interest everybody's interest? And also, when officials announce sanctions, they call it surgical. But in reality, they are about as surgical as chainsaw. Research published in the Lancet Global Health suggests that unilateral sanctions since 1970 have been associated with tens of millions of deaths worldwide. And then we have silent sieges like in Iraq during the 90s, where medicine and clean water became luxuries. Or the tragic case of Armin, a 7-year-old Iranian boy who was suffering from hemophilia. The treatment he needed existed, but nobody dared to sell it to Iran for the fear of US sanctions. He died from preventable complications. More recently, sanctions imposed in Venezuela were followed by a deep economic collapse. One study estimated an excess of 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone. And then there is the 1960 State Department memo on Cuba that explicitly argued for bringing about hunger and desperation to weaken the country. So sometimes the side effects are actually the point. Now, here's the point you will hardly hear on the mainstream media. Sanctions are not free for Americans. They impose a massive hidden tax to its economy. Research shows that US sanctions cost America $15 to $19 billion in lost merchandise exports every year. That translates to more than 200,000 lost jobs, mostly in high-wage sectors like advanced manufacturing and aerospace. There's also a compliance tax. You think your bank fees are high? You know what? US and Canadian financial institutions spend $61 billion every year just on sanctions screening and financial crime compliance. That's a staggering amount of money not being spent on healthcare or innovation otherwise. Also, when the US sanctions a country, US companies doing business there have to leave. For instance, since the Russia-Ukrainian war, there are a number of US companies that have left the country. To name some, McDonald's, Starbucks, KFC, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Apple, I can name many more, but you get the point. Apart from that, when a US company is forced to exit a sanctioned country, foreign competitors happily take their place. The resulting loss of US market share is not so temporary, as sanctioned countries and their trading partners design US origin technology and intermediate goods out of their supply chains to insulate themselves from future policy shifts. Sanctions also eliminate future opportunities such as infrastructural projects, energy investments, technology partnerships, and long-term market presence. These invisible losses are nearly impossible to measure. The US Chamber of Commerce once estimated that the embargo on Cuba cost the American economy over $1 billion annually in lost exports. Sanctions on Iran have been estimated to cost the United States over $175 billion in lost trade and hundreds of thousands of job opportunities. For average American consumer, this translates into higher living costs. For instance, when the US and its allies sanctioned Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, US gasoline prices increased by 49% and diesel prices by 55% within a 5-month period. Perhaps the most significant hidden cost of the aggressive use of financial sanctions is the potential erosion of the US dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency. The dollar's dominance is the foundation of American economic power, and that allows the US to borrow at lower rates and maintain massive trade deficits without the immediate risk of balance of payment crisis. However, by weaponizing the dollar-based financial system, US forced other countries to seek alternatives. So, it can be said that sanctions weaken domestic economic base while failing to achieve their foreign policy objectives. Moreover, the long-term threat of de-dollarization suggests that the very power that makes sanctions possible, the dominance of the dollar, may be the ultimate casualty of their overuse. Now that we know how sanctions work, in the next video, I'm going to talk about how countries under the sanctions survive. We will also see ingenious or sometimes crazy ways these countries bypass the final boss of the global financial system. So tag along for the next one.